from the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies today. And it gives us great pleasure to welcome our speaker, a very distinguished speaker, Dr. Ros Stuart-Buttle. And she was formerly Senior Lecturer in Theology and Education at the University of Liverpool, Hope. And she was also Director of the Centre for Christian Education. Ros studied English and history and qualified as a post-primary teacher at the Institute of Education in London. She subsequently did a Master's in Arts in Religious Studies at the Institute of Religious Studies in New York. And she went on then to complete her PhD in theology in 2011. She's worked as Director of Educational Outreach at Ushaw College and was formerly Director of St. Bede's Institute. She was postdoctoral teaching fellow in Liverpool Hope, and she has won great recognition for her expertise in education and religious education, and particularly in developing and leading online learning for open distance adult theological education. And she's been doing this for many years, way before the current COVID crisis has led us all online. And she's researched culture, media, technology, and education. And today she's going to speak to us about authority, pedagogy, and online religious education. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And thank you for a lovely introduction. So my lecture this afternoon, as I said, focusing on authority, pedagogy and online religious education. And I think it's important to be clear about the context in which I'm going to talk from. And the context is Catholic adult religious education, both formal education and non-formal. So I would include university theology as well as professional development, faith development, for example, for teachers in Catholic schools, lay ministers or catechists, but also wider adult learning in the community as well. What I'm not going to do is define or analyse the concept of authority in broad philosophical terms, or try and do this across different religions. Nor will I explore wider issues about authority in the Catholic Church or in the Irish cultural context. And if you're listening from a different academic subject or a different sector of education, well, I hope that you can draw some resonance for your own situation. As Trish said in the introduction, much of my teaching and research since 2004 has centred on online adult theological education. Perhaps I was well ahead of the game in this 17 years ago, but COVID, as we all know, has rapidly changed the situation over the past year. And for many people, online learning has had to become the new norm. But firstly, if I can frame my underlying thesis, which is that online religious education offers an interruptive pedagogy. That is how I have interpreted the approach that makes most sense to me. What do I mean by an interruptive pedagogy? And on screen, you can see the book where I outline this through both theory and empirical research. Well, back in 2004, much of the narrative surrounding the internet was couched in a language of novelty and disruption, which perhaps reflected rhetoric rather than reality. At the same time, going back 15, 16, 17 years, the emerging conversation about online learning was doing pretty much the same thing. And proponents were making radical claims that online education was pedagogically disruptive because it changed everything that we were doing and brought new, flexible, informal, innovative teaching and learning approaches. Well, my research indicated that it's certainly possible to do teaching and learning in new ways using the internet and media technologies, but it also tends towards sustaining or replication of existing practices, especially if pedagogy is just transferred from the face-to-face classroom into the online environment. So setting up a dialectic of disruption on the one hand versus a continuity with existing practices, it just didn't resonate with my own teaching and research experience online. Perhaps more significantly, the concept of interruption spoke to me in theological terms, acknowledging here the work of Belgian theologian Lieven Bover. A theology of interruption offers us a way to think about the identity and the relevance of Christian faith in the midst of contemporary culture. Interruption avoids two extremes. It avoids a rupture or discontinuity between Christian faith and the contemporary world, as if the two should never meet. It also avoids Christian frames of reference being too easily assimilated or lost in a secularized and pluralized world. Instead, Bover argued that the Christian story always has and always is being interrupted by an encounter with otherness, culture, God breaking in new ways. So in other words, human history has always been open to a new reality of God at work in the church, in the world, in the here and now. And I would argue that this way of thinking about interruption invites both faithfulness to the content and sources of the faith tradition, as well as opening up to the otherness of new ways, new ideas, and new possibilities. And so this became for me a very relevant way of thinking about what the new technologies have to offer to the Christian gospel. Well, taking up the theme of religious authority, which is the focus of this particular talk this afternoon, of course, it's not a new question. Many others have pointed to the landscapes of contemporary culture in our late or post-modernity situation as posing a crisis of transmission for Christian faith. This is also perceived as a crisis of authority. The consequences of modernization have seen a growth of rationalism and scientific technical knowledge, increasing secularization, a lessening of the influence of religion in the public sphere, and the spread of relativized truth claims, along with greater reliance on the autonomy of the individual person. And to this, we can add the advances brought by information and communication technologies that have certainly contributed to a changing culture where sources of authority have shifted. Taking the internet, it's a decentralized and a free space that has brought open access, open thinking, and open dissemination of information. This raises questions, perhaps, about the credibility and the trustworthiness of sources. And a dominant narrative has suggested that forms of religious authority are eroded by digital technologies, which are perceived to disrupt and displace traditional faith doctrines and domains. Teachings and doctrines once controlled through official channels, such as the church or the clergy or religious organisation, it is argued, are much more readily open to challenge, contradiction, or else just to be plain ignored. But the internet, if we think about this, it also brings opportunities for information sharing, engagement, creativity, and self-expression, with the power for an individual or a group to control, share, use as they wish, and for whatever purposes. So an alternative narrative sees that religious engagement with the new media technologies can complement and support religious authority by harnessing the interactive and the dialogic capabilities of online social networks and restructuring new forms of expressing and experiencing religious authority in online environments. So what does this mean for online religious education or faith formation? What are some of the issues that challenge those with responsibility as Christian educators, both to uphold the meta-narrative of divine revelation and the primary sources of doctrinal tradition, but to negotiate this in an online world? Some big questions and complex challenges there, I would suggest. Over the past 20 or so years, sociologists of religion and media have begun to explore religious authority in online faith communities. And on screen, you've got an example of the work of Heidi Campbell, who would be up there among one of the leading voices. And this question of whether the internet and the new technologies bring changes on how religious authority is changed. Of course, there is a lack of agreement and therefore much discussion about what constitutes online religious authority. But such sociologists and media experts, using the underpinning theory of Max Weber back from the 1950s, who was one of the first to think about religious authority in various typologies, they have started to classify religious authority in the online environment to be thought about in 4 different sort of groupings. And I'm just going to sort of put that on screen and let you read it for now, and then return to it at the end of the lecture. So if we can think about online religious authority and how that might be expressed through beliefs, the creeds we share, the teachings, the shared faith, the identity that binds us together, through recognised sources and texts of scriptures, documents, catechisms, teachings, through structure, through religious community, patterns of organisation and church life, liturgy, and through roles and hierarchies of leaders, of clergy, of teachers, of authority figures. So when religious authority, when religious engagement moves online, it's argued that the status of the church or the academy, who in the past were the authoritative sources and gatekeepers of knowledge, well, it's argued that that is challenged. So I'd like to probe this further, and to do so in 3 ways that I would suggest are pertinent, particularly to online religious education. Firstly, the internet and the new technologies. It's claimed that they alter the nature of our relationship with knowledge. So we might say that online culture raises key epistemological questions. Where and what is knowledge? How do we come to know online? Who has access to this knowing? And there is a contemporary equating of knowledge with information. Sorry, I've just knocked something on the computer, take that off. There's a contemporary equating of knowledge with information. Online education, for example, is a very useful means of sharing and providing people with access to information and communication exchange. But how does it promote having knowledge? In the digital age, information is processed and transferred as data, and of course the spiraling power of technology to deal with ever increasing amounts of information gathering, storage and management. But finding or having access to information is not the same as having knowledge. Knowledge, I would argue, is the meaning and the sense that we make out of information when it's been assimilated and contextualized. In other words, assimilated, taken on board, apprehended, used, judged, and experienced. Religious knowledge, it's generally agreed, is based on historical systems of belief and tradition from past centuries, often communicated and taught by doctrines and propositions, but that by their very nature were asserted as absolute and true, and often mediated by a theological elite, clergy, theologians, who interpreted and taught Christian doctrines, generally using formal teaching methods. But today's views of knowledge move towards theories where knowledge is constructed. Learners build knowledge through exercising their own choices, reflections, judgments, and experiences, rather than relying on the authoritarian position of others. Online education commonly embraces the theories and practices that are rooted in constructivism, which of course is an umbrella term, a meta theory for teaching and learning that places the learner as actively engaged in building knowledge and meaning, and often through collaborative activity with their peer. We call that forms of social constructivism. So this moves the online religious classroom away from content-driven or transmission methods towards process models that invite the exploration of experience and seek and prompt critical reflection with peer exchange in group interaction. And one way perhaps of thinking about this is a sort of learning from below to emphasize the co-creation and sharing of knowledge, as opposed to learning or receiving from above, a receiving or accumulating the objective teachings of others. So one challenge, I would say, for the online religious education environment is to find resonance between the primary sources of the faith tradition and the online interpretation and discussion of these sources in the light of contemporary conditions. And interestingly, this is a question that's being currently addressed by Muslim education communities as well. Another challenge to religious authority that I would say is posed by religious engagement online concerns the multiplicity of voices and the multidimensionality of hypermedia. What do I mean by that? Well, firstly, hypermedia connects text files, graphics, audio, video, animation, search engines, files, documents, PDFs, etc., across the internet. And this and the way information or data is presented differs significantly from traditional linear and sequential patterns of thought, or even the printed text. Because online users, we count ourselves and think about how we use, say, the internet or online resources. The online users can select and view contents according to their own order of navigation, choice, control, timing, pace. Perhaps those of us who have set up online courses have got some experience of this when our students don't follow the conceptual sequencing or access our course materials in the order in which we planned, but they jump around and pick and mix and start in the middle or go to the end first. But this is the online user and how we use resources online, not just as a reader or a receiver, but as a consumer, a co-creator, an editor, a producer, depending on how we want to use the material we access. Now, of course, this allows a multiplicity of voices across a vast range and types of online information. And I don't need to say this, but we would all have experience if we look for web materials for Catholic teachings. Well, we're going to come across all sorts, and we'll all be aware of this. Probably, particularly those of us who have had the experience of our students coming across weird and wonderful resources and presenting them in their work as if they are Catholic magisterial teaching. But critics will say that this multiplicity of material and unofficial voices undermines the plausibility of religious sources and teachings because it presents potentially oppositional information that negatively affects the credibility of religious institutions and leadership. On the other hand, we might say that it also frees the learning of Catholic theology from traditional structures and sources, and thus helps to diminish elite forms of power and authority, giving non-professionals, lay people, control over and access to religious information and religious knowledge. But whichever sort of line of argument we find ourselves agreeing with, I think a legitimate question for all of us involved in online religious education is when we use such things as online discussions, search engines, blogs, YouTube videos, etc. Do we use them in ways that contribute to or advance an understanding of religious truth and divine authority? Or do we risk the relativism of popular opinion and delegitimizing of authentic Christian teaching? Pope Francis, writing in, I think it was 2014, for that year's World Day of Social Communications, he wrote, "The variety of opinions being aired through the new media can be seen as helpful, but it also enables people to barricade themselves behind sources of information which only confirm their own wishes and ideas." I think there's much food for thought here. This leads on to my third question, or my third challenge perhaps, for online religious education. And that is a question about the role of the online religious teacher as representing the authority of the church, the institution, or the academy. Much of the literature on online education, and I'm talking about the secular literature on online education, it certainly agrees that online teaching presence is key. Way back in 1999, Palloff and Pratt, who wrote about the role of the online tutor, they came up with a strapline that sort of remained sacrosanct ever since. Technology does not teach. Effective teachers do. But in terms of thinking about online religious engagement with students, well, should the teacher be the expert, the sage on the stage, or as much of the online learning kind of theory suggests, should they take up a position more as being the guide on the side? Scholars of media and religion who studied across Christian, Jewish and Muslim online learning communities have noted a pattern for a levelling out of roles and hierarchy, representing a challenge, they say, for the religious leader, specialist or teacher, in other words, the one who has traditionally been in control of the religious curriculum and pedagogy. And scholars have also noted that in postmodern faith communities, it is horizontal interaction among religious followers that is seen as more important than vertical top-down teaching of traditional doctrine. Authority is recognised often as decentralised or holding communal expertise, rather than as established by a single or an official group. Well, my own research with adult online learners kind of explored this question, among others, but this was one of the questions that I was interested in. And when I asked adult online learners about how they experienced online teaching presence, the empirical data was overwhelmingly positive about the need for the online teacher to support and direct the learning of the group. There was no doubt about that. And this was seen as coming through the teacher's design, organisation and management of the online course, through their guiding, facilitating the discourse, the peer exchange, for modelling intellectual leadership and subject expertise, for giving feedback, guiding resources, all the things that we would expect a good teacher to do. But the way that the adult learners articulated online teaching presence was interesting. And this ranged from them saying they wanted a formal teacher, whatever that means, to the teacher online being an informal guide, a group facilitator, a coach, or a mentor. Now, we might argue that teaching involves all of those things, be an interesting thing to take. But I think what it suggests is that there are changing conceptions about the role of the teacher as an authority figure and how that is expressed in the online classroom. Some adult learners I saw, they wanted more direct, formal religious instruction. Others wanted far less. They saw the teacher's role as there primarily to act as the online forum leader. Some even said that the online teacher or the institutional virtual learning environment in fact set up new boundaries, new control measures of what was being expected by way of religious orthodoxy and expression. And they felt boxed in a sort of online walled garden approach. And this complexity was echoed by the online teachers themselves. they recognised a need to assume some form of authoritative position in terms of their responsibility to the faith tradition they were teaching or to the educational institution whom they were representing. They advocated a model of invitational rather than a controlling authority. And they saw their role less about presenting a set of religious sources or teachings, and more about enabling their students to critically reflect and assess through learner-centred approaches and in dialogue with other worldviews. So, to try and draw some conclusions about this, well, certainly it is possible to make claims for a disruption in weakening sources of religious authority due to the influence of new technologies, bringing about changes in communication and the capabilities of the internet to expand access to resources, facilitate new practices, and support new ways of learning and social capital. And certainly this presents challenges to a traditional interpretation of who and what constitutes religious authority. So, for example, in terms of hierarchy, as I've hinted, we have alternative multiple voices. We have authority recognised online as decentralised or communal expertise. We have perhaps a translation or a loss of traditional offline roles in the new online context. In terms of structures, maybe a subversion of religious authority if we think about that as a hierarchical structure, and instead an empowerment of personal freedom and self-expression. We have new unofficial grassroots forms of online community and gathering, and this leads to questions of connection to traditional ecclesial structures and patterns. When we think about the authority of beliefs, religious beliefs, well, the new media allows widespread unofficial interpretations of religious beliefs, all of which are widely available in the public forum. It allows new forms of knowledge construction and identity expression. There is a shared discourse that might redefine church or community, experienced possibly globally, and yet connected to just as much to local individuals and local organisation. And in certain terms of the sources and the texts of our tradition, well, I've hinted of the misinformation or the disinformation that the new media can give rise to. The challenge perhaps to official church teaching and how they are interpreted. The loss of influence or control over religious materials when hypermedia allows anybody and everybody to use them. The translation or the transformation of how the written word of our scriptures is expressed digitally. So many different ways to think about how the challenges and the tensions to religious authority resulting from online engagement. But that's just one narrative, as I hope I've tried also to show as well. Online religious engagement can also be characterised by connectedness and negotiation. And I would argue that today, particularly in the last year or so, with the COVID situation upon us, we've seen that the internet and the technologies that we use are grounded in people's everyday lives. Education is just one example of this. Schools and universities having to move their learning and teaching online. But we've also seen this through in Catholic sense through our experience of liturgy and prayer, online masses and services, etc. And certainly there are studies emerging that are showing faith groups and religious communities are reshaping or culturing the new media to adapt and use for their own way of life and practices of faith. So I would argue that we can also say that religious authority and expression is being reframed and in some cases even sustained by online practices. Rather than being threatened by the internet and new technologies, this surely brings possibilities for creative and new expression, both in church and in the academy, for ways of doing religious education and faith formation. And so I assert that online education and online engagement brings exciting opportunities to advance the work of learning in faith and theology. Yes, certainly there are theological and pedagogical challenges, and Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI hit the nail on the head when he wrote and addressed the Pontifical Council of Culture back in 2010. And he called for the new technologies to be used with creative intelligence, a critical sense, and an attentive discernment. For me, this is a theology of interruption. To evaluate the online technologies in the light of Christian tradition and best learning practices, but with openness to their potential and their opportunities for new ways of believing, sharing, learning, and living together in faith. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now and come